刚刚背对着这里过来。你拿着这个，你这样啊。
停顿一下，应该是要停顿一下。
对，做完腿以后站在这
里，停顿几秒钟，转过来，停顿几秒钟，转过来，再走过去。
对，然后你看这样。
啊，从那儿过来。
没走，开着走。
肯定要过两下，然后一起照片。
从前面过，从主席台前面过。主席台前面过，不是讲台前面过，从前面过，啊，从这过，对，这站有人一会儿。从讲台前面走，从讲台前面走。从讲台前面走。
靠拢一点，靠拢一点。第一排跟起来，第一排跟没有，你也把拉起来。
你起来，别忘了。你要看着。
快点！
证书收好，收上来。把证书全部先收起来。
自己拿好。
Okay, welcome back. So this afternoon session, we turn from policy discussion to personal stories. Behind every statistic are real people whose lives have been profoundly affected. So this afternoon session is titled Ceremony of Quitting CCP Movement and Testimony from Victims. Please welcome our host, moderator, Marian Chen, Board of Director at Consilium Institute.
Thank you, Christina. Distinguished members of Congress, distinguished representative of the Congress, and honorable guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Welcome to this special proclamation and a celebration session recognizing the courage of individuals who have chosen freedom, conscience over fear. It's my honor to host today's proclamation and celebration and a human rights testimony featuring victims and survivors of persecution of the Chinese Communist Party. Throughout history, people around the world have stood against totalitarian system. Today, millions of Chinese people continue the peaceful journey by publicly declaring their withdrawal from the Chinese Communist Party and its affiliated organization in a movement known as Quitting CCP or 退党 movement. Since 2004, over 464 million Chinese people have declared they are quitting CCP, making it one of the largest non-violent movements of conscience in modern history. We also remember those who continue to pay an enormous price for exercising their freedom of belief, particularly Falun Gong practitioners who have faced one of the longest-running campaigns of religious persecution in the world. Today, our testimony consists of 4 parts. Part 1, speech by Dr. Zhiyuan Wang, President of Global Service Center for Quitting the CCP. Part 2, congratulations to those who renounced their membership in the Chinese Communist Party and its affiliated organizations from Christopher McNeil, representing for Chairman Andy August. And part 3 is a congressional proclamation commending the Global Service Center for Quitting CCP by the congressman, by the representative Christopher McNeil. This may enter in U.S. congressional record. Part 4, hearing first-hand testimony from victims of persecution, including the Falun Gong practitioner from New York and the Falun Gong practitioner from Maryland. And their voices represent countless others whose stories remain unheard. As we honor their courage, may we be reminded that the defense of human dignity is a shared responsibility of all free people. Thank you for joining us today. Let us begin the ceremony. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Zhiyuan Wang to give us a speech.
尊敬的各位议员，尊敬的各位来宾，今天我想和大家谈一个看似简单却关乎亿万人命运的问题：我们是谁？ 70多年来，中国共产党从没有让中国人做过这样的选择，从小开始就被置于中共的掌控之中。我全部念完了。好看。从小开始，你就被置于中共的掌控之中。从加入少先队到共青团，再到共产党，他一步一步替你贴上了标签。同时，他用尽一切国家机器或宣传手段，长期把自己塑造成中国唯一的代表，让中国或中共在世界眼中变成了同义词。
Distinguished Congressmen, honorable guests, ladies and gentlemen. Today I would like to talk to you about a seemingly simple question, yet one that concerns the fate of hundreds of millions of people. Who are we? For more than 70 years, the Chinese Communist Party has never given the Chinese people a choice. From childhood, you're placed under the control of the Chinese Communist Party. From joining the Young Pioneers to the Communist Youth League and eventually to the party itself, it gradually assigns labels to you. At the same time, it uses every means of state machinery and propaganda to portray itself as the sole representative of China, making China and CCP synonymous in the eyes of the world.
但是今天，我要在这里郑重地告诉各位，也告诉全世界，中国不等于中国共产党，中国人民也不应该被中国共产党代表。
But today, I want to solemnly tell you all, and the whole world, China is not the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese people should not be represented by the Chinese Communist Party.
这不是一句口号，而是4亿多中国人用自己的本名或者化名一笔一画写下的声明：中共不等于中国，中共无权代表中国人。
This is not a slogan. It is a declaration written by more than 400 million Chinese people using their real names or pseudonyms. The Chinese Communist Party does not equal China, and it has no right to represent the Chinese people.
截至今天，已经有4亿6400多万人在退党网站上公开声明退出中国的党团队组织。仅今年上半年，就有695万多人，平均每天有38000多人宣布退出中共的党团队组织。
As of today, over 464 million people have publicly declared their withdrawal from the Chinese Communist Party and its affiliated organizations. In the first half of this year, 6.95 million people made this choice, averaging over 38,000 per day.
朋友们，这是人类历史上从未有过的一场精神觉醒运动，它不是一场暴力革命而是靠普通人在内心深处发出的那一声我不要被中共代替的精神觉醒。
Friends, this is an awakening movement unprecedented in human history. Not a military revolution, but a spiritual and moral awakening of ordinary people. A cry from the depth of their hearts. I do not want to be represented by the CCP.
这场觉醒运动早已跨越了太平洋。今年6月，美国国会通过了444号决议，指出中国共产党是 一个对全球稳定与和平构成严重威胁的犯罪组织，并指出了该党从事了系统性的欺骗、好战行为以及反人类罪行，其规模在历史上极为罕见。
This movement of awakening has already extended beyond the Pacific Ocean. In June of this year, the U.S. Congress passed Resolution 444, which states that the Chinese Communist Party is a criminal organization posing a grave threat to global stability and peace, and that the Chinese Communist Party has engaged in systemic deception, warmongering, and crimes against humanity, the likes of which have few historical parallels.
联邦司法机构揭露了一桩一桩的事实，中共利用自由世界的法律、开放的社会、包容的舆论，发动了法律战、舆论战、认知战，把美国自由的制度变成了攻击美国的武器。
Federal judicial institutions have revealed one fact after another. The CCP uses the laws, open societies, and inclusive public opinion of the free world to wage legal, informational, and cognitive warfare, turning America's free system into a weapon against American freedom.
然而，当世界无法清楚区分中国人与中国共产党的时候，在这场中共无孔不入的渗透中，深受影响的正是许多生活在自由世界奉公守法的海外华人，他们因为中共的行为而被误解、被质疑，这正是中共最乐意看到的，让全世界分不清中共或中国人，从而将海外的华人强行地捆绑在一起。
However, when the world cannot clearly distinguish between the Chinese people and the Chinese Communist Party, in this pervasive infiltration by the CCP, many law-abiding overseas Chinese living in the free world may also face misunderstanding and suspicion. This is precisely the outcome the CCP most desires: to confuse the world with the difference between China and the CCP, thereby forcibly binding overseas Chinese to the CCP.
而让世界清醒认识这一点，不只是中国人的责任，也是帮助自由世界维护公平与正义的重要一步。
Therefore, letting the world see that the Chinese people and the Chinese Communist Party are not the same thing is not only the responsibility of the Chinese people, but also an important step in helping the free world uphold fairness and justice.
所以，今天我要对华人同胞们说，主动与中共切割，就是对我们自己、对下一代最好的保护。不要再被误认为自己是中共的延伸。
So today, I want to say to my fellow Chinese compatriots, proactively severing ties with the CCP is the best protection for ourselves and for future generations, preventing us from being mistakenly seen as an extension of the CCP.
三退，退出中共的党、团队、组织，办理退党证明，向世界、向历史，也是向自己宣告，我是堂堂正正的中华儿女，不是中共的一部分。
三退, withdrawing from the Chinese Communist Party, its youth league, and its young pioneers, and obtaining a certificate of withdrawal, is a declaration to the world, to history, and to oneself. I am Chinese, and my identity is rooted in dignity and integrity. I am not part of the CCP.
4亿6400多万人已经站出来，脱离了中共。今天我呼吁每一位还在犹豫、还在观望的同胞， 你的身份是上天赋予你的尊严，不是中共的政治资产，拿回它，拒绝被它绑架，只需要你的一个选择。谢谢大家。
More than 464 million people have already stepped forward and renounced their ties to the Chinese Communist Party. Today, I urge every compatriot who is still hesitating and observing, your identity is the dignity bestowed upon you by heaven, not the political property of the CCP. Take it back. Refuse to be held hostage by it. It only takes one choice. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wang, and you make us all clear that, make us clear again, that reclaiming one's identity is also protecting one's future. Now, please join me in welcoming our honorees as we begin the congratulation ceremony. And also, please, Mr. Christopher McNeil, would you please? Yeah, thank you. But now it's like you first shake hands with our honorees, and then after that, you will give this proclamation after that. No. Yeah. Also, Dr. Wang, would you please come up? Yeah, please. Thank you. And please be here. Yes. And please. Yes, so, Mr. Christopher and Mr. Wang will give a warm congratulations to every honorees right now, okay? The first one, please. The first one is Wanxia Zhang, Miss Wanxia Zhang. Yeah. And then... The next one is Yin Xingxiao. Next one is Zheng Jinxiu. Next one is Li Zhuo. Next one is Wang Zongsheng. Next one is Ren Penglai. Next one is Li Xuan. Next one is Xiao Juanli. Next one is Chen Dan. Next one is Zhu Lijing. Next one is Gao Yan. Next one is Gao Jianming. Next one is Lu Caiyun. Next one is Zheng Yali. Next one is Sun Huiying. Next one is Yao Juan. Next one is Yu Pingfan. Next one is Lei Sheng. Next one is Song Jingzhi. Next one is Ye Xiuli. Next one is Li Shuying. Next one is Pan Jun. Next one is Wang Xiaoling. Next one is Shao Junwei. Next one is Liao Qiulan. Next one is He Youlan. Next one is Zhang Wenfeng. Next one is Wu Mengyan. Next one is Yang Yan. Next one is Chen Liyan. Okay, next one is Gu Hongwei. We have someone more? Okay, sorry, I don't have the name list. Okay. So. Congratulations to all these honorees. Yeah. This is a very honorable, this is a very honorable moment. So today we have at least 31 Chinese immigrants here who have publicly announced they are quitting the CCP And in recognition, they have already received the certificate from the center, global center, of quitting CCP. Thank you. Thank you very much. So thank you to Dr. Wang and thank you to Christopher McNeil, okay? Thank you. Now we are honored to welcome the representative of Congressman Andy August, who will offer their commendation and the recognition of the Global Service Center for quitting the CCP. This will go into the congressional record. Please.
Thank you. On behalf of Congressman Andy Ogles, I'll be presenting here what our Congressman Andy Ogles presented in the congressional record. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to recognize the courage of Falun Gong practitioners who for more than 2 decades have faced severe persecution in China because of their beliefs centered on the principles of truthfulness, compassion, and forbearance, and on a desire to revive traditional Chinese culture and values. According to documentation compiled by Minghui.org, at least 5,910 Falun Gong practitioners have died as a result of repression by the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP. The CCP has also subjected Falun Gong practitioners to arbitrary detention, torture, and forced organ harvesting, an atrocity that shocks the conscience. I also rise to recognize the Tweedong movement, translated as the Quitting the CCP movement, and to commend the Global Service Center for quitting the Chinese Communist Party, known as the Tweedong Center, for its work in support of freedom of conscience and human dignity. In December 2004, the Epoch Times published a report titled 9 Commentaries on the Communist Party, an account of the party's history. According to that report, the CCP has been responsible since 1949 for the unnatural deaths of 60 to 80 million Chinese people, and by now, likely more. It also highlighted the hundreds of millions of abortions committed under Chinese coercive population control regimes. And in 2013, China's own health ministry corroborated this when it released data showing that more than 300 million abortions had been performed since 1971. Over the following 2 decades, according to organizers, millions of copies of the 9 commentaries were reproduced and distributed within China by Falun Gong practitioners, often at great personal risk. That effort helped give rise to the Tweedong movement, through which individuals can renounce their affiliation with the CCP, the Communist Youth League, and the Young Pioneers, frequently using pseudonyms to protect their safety. The Tweedong Center, based in New York, collects these withdrawal statements through volunteer networks and tracks the movement's growth. Its volunteers outside China also reach Chinese citizens by phone, message, and email to share information about withdrawing from the CCP and its affiliated organizations. In recent years, Chinese immigrants have publicly announced their withdrawals at Tweedong rallies in Flushing, New York, receiving certificates memorializing their decisions. According to the Tweedong Center's records, as of July 2026, more than 464 million people have submitted statements dissociating themselves from the CCP or its affiliated organizations. This movement of nonviolent resistance to totalitarianism represents an awakening of conscience grounded in a desire to reclaim China's cultural and moral heritage. Such resistance helps lay the moral foundation for a future of greater freedom and justice in China, while also standing against the spread of communist ideology worldwide. The witness of those who participate in this movement should also remind Americans of the continuing dangers posed by communist ideology. The CCP has a well-documented history of transnational repression, and the Tweedong Center states that its own work has faced intimidation and disruption here in the United States. According to the center, it received 8 threatening letters between April 20th and 28th of 2025, and its public booths in Flushing were vandalized on April 29th, 2025. Transnational repression targeting advocates on American soil is a serious matter, and such conduct has no place in the United States. Mr. Speaker, the right to hold and peacefully express one's beliefs and to associate or disassociate freely is a fundamental human right. I honor the courage of Falun Gong practitioners and the volunteers of the Tuidang movement, and I commend the Global Service Center for quitting the Chinese Communist Party for its work on behalf of freedom of conscience. I urge my colleagues to join me in standing with all who peacefully advocate for human dignity and the freedom to believe. Thank you. And on behalf of Congressman Andy Ogles, I'd like to present this as an official record of the U.S. Congress from Andy Ogles to Dr. Wong.
Thank you, Mr. Christopher McNeil, and thank you, Dr. Wong. Now we are honored to come to the final session, which brings us to the heart of today's program. Today we have the privilege of hearing first-hand testimony from two Falun Gong practitioners whose personal experiences remind us why the protection of freedom of belief remains a vital human rights issue. Our first speaker is Mrs. Wanxia Zhang, a Falun Gong practitioner from New York, who will share her personal experience of persecution. Following her testimony, we will hear from Ms. Elisa Zhou, a Falun Gong practitioner from Maryland, who will highlight the ongoing campaign to rescue her mother, a Falun Gong practitioner who is now detained in Wuhan, China. So please welcome our first speaker, Ms. Wanxia Zhang.
"尊敬的议员和来宾，大家好。我叫张万霞。1998年，我看到身患绝症的母亲通过修炼法轮功恢复了健康，从此我开始修炼法轮功。我们希望按照真善忍做好人，却因此遭到中共长期的残酷迫害。"
Distinguished Congressmen, honorable guests, hello everyone. My name is Zhang Wanxia. In 1998, I witnessed my mother, who was seriously ill, recover her health through practicing Falun Gong, and I have since been practicing Falun Gong myself. We hope to be good people according to the principles of truthfulness, compassion, forbearance. However, we have suffered long-term and brutal persecution by the CCP as a result.
中共1999年开始镇压法轮功后，由于不放弃信仰，我和先生尹信晓被非法抓捕、拘留、劳教或判刑。我本人被非法劫持到洗脑班半年多时间，被劳教2年又加期1个月。先生被非法劳教3年，判刑3年半。我的母亲不断遭受骚扰和迫害，长期承受巨大精神压力，最终含冤离世。
After the Chinese Communist Party began its persecution of Falun Gong in 1999, my husband Yin Xin-xiao and I were illegally arrested, detained, or sentenced because we refused to renounce our faith. I was illegally detained in a brainwashing center for more than 6 months, then sentenced to 2 years of forced labor with an additional month, and my husband was illegally sentenced to 3 years of forced labor and 3.5 years of imprisonment. My mother suffered constant harassment and persecution, endured immense mental stress for a long time, and passed away.
怀孕8个多月时，我因为在天安门广场高喊"法轮大法好"，被7、8名警察扑倒在地。一个警察当众朝我的肚子重重打了一拳。我担心腹中的孩子，更难过的是，他还没有出生，就已经成为中共迫害的受害者。
When I was more than 8 months pregnant, I was tackled to the ground by 7 or 8 policemen for shouting "Falun Dafa is good" in Tiananmen Square, and a police officer punched me hard in the stomach in public. I worried about whether my unborn child would survive. Even more heartbreaking was that he had already become a victim of persecution by the CCP before he was even born.
孩子出生仅3天，10多名警察就在半夜闯入我家，威胁要把我送去劳教。由于警察重复骚扰恐吓，我被迫流离失所。当我回家看望儿子时，警察却当着年仅21个月的孩子的面，强行把我抓走。孩子的哭声和惊恐的眼神，至今仍深深地刺痛着我的心。
Just 3 days after my child's birth, around midnight that day, a dozen police officers broke into my home, threatening to send me to a labor camp. I was forced to become homeless due to repeated harassment and intimidation by the police. When I returned home to see my son, I was again forcibly taken away by the police in front of him, who was only 21 months old. My child's cries and terrified eyes still deeply pierce my heart.
在劳教所，我被强制抽血和检查内脏。警察看到我健康的内脏，表现出异常的兴奋。后来国际社会陆续曝光中共活摘法轮功学员器官的罪行，我才意识到那次所谓的体检是多么令人后怕。
In the labor camp, I was also forced to have blood drawn and internal organs examined. The doctors were unusually excited to see that my organs were in excellent condition. Years later, as the international community exposed the CCP's crimes of harvesting organs from living Falun Gong practitioners, I realized how terrifying that so-called medical examination truly was.
劳教期间，我还遭受了长期的酷刑。警察连续15天不让我睡觉，强制洗脑。我被绑在铁管子上，连续罚站6天7夜，不准睡觉，不准上厕所，身体严重浮肿到鞋都穿不上。最绝望的时候，我甚至想到结束自己的生命。但正是法轮大法给予我的信念，让我坚持地活了下来。
During my time in the labor camp, I suffered prolonged torture. The police deprived me of sleep for 15 consecutive days, forcing me to undergo brainwashing. I was tied to an iron pipe and forced to stand for 6 days and 7 nights without sleep or access to the toilet. My body became so severely swollen that I couldn't even wear shoes. In my most desperate moments, I even considered ending my life. But it was the faith that Falun Dafa gave me that allowed me to persevere and survive.
2005年，我终于获释回家，可快5岁的孩子已经认不出我。在他7岁时，父亲又因坚持信仰再次被判刑。父母长期遭受迫害，使孩子在恐惧中长大，失去了原本应该拥有的幸福童年。
In 2005, I was finally released and returned home, but my son, almost 5 years old, didn't recognize me. When he was 7, his father was sentenced again for his beliefs. The long-term persecution suffered by his parents caused my child to grow up in fear, robbing him of a happy childhood he should have had.
2017年，我和儿子来到美国，2年后，丈夫也来到美国，我们一家团聚。今天，我的儿子尹修贤在飞天大学学习中国古典舞，是神韵艺术团的实习舞蹈演员。他立志用艺术讲述信仰与希望，帮助更多人了解真相，制止迫害。然而，中共的跨国迫害已经延伸到美国。神韵演出期间，屡次遭到炸弹威胁和破坏，这让我再次感受到中共的暴力和邪恶。
In 2017, my son and I came to the United States, and 2 years later, my husband also came, reuniting our family. Today, my son, Yin Xiuxian, is studying classical Chinese dance at Feitian College and is an intern dancer with Shenyun Performing Arts. He is determined to use art to tell stories of faith and hope, helping more people understand the truth and stop the persecution. However, the CCP's transnational persecution has extended to the United States. Shenyun performances have been repeatedly subjected to bomb threats and sabotage, which has made me feel the CCP's violence and evil once again.
我和我的家人都是这场迫害的亲历者和幸存者。我们知道，中共对法轮功的迫害不仅发生在中国，它已经威胁到世界真实的信仰自由和人权价值。
My family and I are both witnesses to and survivors of this persecution. We know that the CCP's persecution of Falun Gong is not limited to China. It is already threatening the freedom of belief and values of human rights so cherished by the wider world.
我真诚地呼吁各国政府和所有珍惜自由的人们，共同制止这场持续至今的迫害，保护信仰自由，维护人类共同的尊严。解体中共是我们一家人共同的心愿。谢谢大家。
I sincerely call on governments of all countries and all people who cherish freedom to jointly stop this persecution that continues to this day, protect freedom of belief, and safeguard the common dignity of mankind. The disintegration of the CCP is the common wish of our family. Thank you all.
Thank you, Ms. Wenxia Zhang, and I'm sure your story will encourage more people to quit the CCP and also encourage us to move on our human rights campaign. Okay. So next, let's welcome Elisa Zhou, who will give a call to help to her mother, the campaign for her mother. Okay.
Honored guests, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Elisa Zhou. Today, I stand before you because my mother cannot speak for herself. At this very moment, she's being held in a detention center in Wuhan, China, solely because she refuses to renounce her faith. This is the fifth arrest since the persecution started in 1999. Today, I would like to tell you her story. On April 15, 2026, police in Wuhan arrested 17 Falun Gong practitioners, including my mother, Youmei Wang. Their only offense was practicing Falun Gong, a peaceful spiritual discipline based on the principles of truthfulness, compassion, and forbearance. Today, my family is not allowed to see her. Even her lawyer has been denied access to her case. My mother is one of the kindest people I have ever known. She taught me to tell the truth, even when telling the truth comes with a cost. She taught me that faith is not merely something we believe, it is something we live. April 30 was supposed to be the day my mother came home. Instead, my family watched as police transferred her into criminal detention. Just before the police vehicle drove away, she turned around and smiled. It was the smile of someone whose faith was stronger than fear. There is something else you should know about my mother. She saved my life long before I could ever try to save hers. I was supposed to be aborted under China's one-child policy because I was my mother's second child. She refused. Because of her courage, I am standing before you today. Now it is my turn to stand for her. Unfortunately, my mother's case is not an isolated one. On June 10, 2026, another Falun Gong practitioner from Wuhan, 63-year-old retired civil servant, Ms. Shang Xiuhu, was taken from her home by police, and she died less than 24 hours after the arrest. Behind every case is a family, a daughter, a husband, a son, parents who never see their loved ones again. I am not asking the world to stand against China. I am asking the world to stand with the Chinese people. I am asking you to stand with families like mine. Freedom of belief is not owning an American value, it is also a Chinese value. It is a universal human right. Every person deserves the freedom to live according to their conscience. Today, I respectfully ask you to continue speaking up for prisoners of conscience. Please continue supporting efforts to protect freedom of religion and belief. Please urge the immediate release of my mother, Youmei Wang, and all those imprisoned simply for their faith. My mother once risked everything so that I could live. Today, I ask you to help protect her life. Not only for my mother, but for every family still waiting, for every prisoner of conscience who cannot speak, and for the hope that one day no one will lose their freedom simply because they choose to believe. Thank you.
Thank you, Elisa Zhou, and I hope that everyone be here can help her to rescue her mother. Okay, now, ladies and gentlemen, today we witnessed one truth told 4 times. That courage is a choice, and conscience cannot be conquered. Freedom is not an idea we admire for a distance. It is a decision made again and again by people who refuse to be silent. Whether we call China home, or America, or anywhere else, our task is the same. Defend the dignity of every person, protect the freedom of every conscience, and build a future where our children inherit not fear, but justice. To our speakers, guests, members of Congress, and all of you, thank you for standing with us today. Thank you and have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you to everyone who shared their stories with such courage. We now turn to one of the most serious human rights issues of our time. Our next panel, titled Enhancing Global Collaboration on Countering Forced Organ Harvesting and Transnational Repression, is really heavy, serious talk. So now, please join me in welcoming our moderator, Jan Jekelek. He's a senior editor in Epoch Times, host of American Thought Leader program. Let's welcome Jan.
It's such a huge pleasure and an honor to be here with you today. Some of you might know this issue of forced organ harvesting from prisoners of conscience in China. This is something we've had evidence of, very significant evidence, for the last 20 years. Basically, 2006 was this when many of us realized that this was real and something that needed to be researched thoroughly. Today we're going to have a panel of people that are deeply, deeply involved in the issue. I've actually written a book recently, Killed to Order, and I highlight a number of their work in this book, sort of explaining how we got to the bottom of it. But we're not going to debate today whether this exists or not. This has been one of the big challenges over the years, right, is to actually get people to understand, no, we're not debating that, we're past that. This is very much a real thing. The thing that we do want to look at, right, is how should we actually respond to this, right? A key argument I make in Killed to Order is that this atrocity is a good word to describe it, it's a window into the mind of the Chinese Communist Party. It's a window into the mind of the regime, if you will. But as of now, the international community, free societies have not really mounted a very significant effort to stop this or even meaningfully really slow this. Although, as I hope a number of our panelists will discuss today, there has been some significant change in recent years and things do look positive. So I think we're ready to start the panel. Okay, so let's invite our panelists up, and once we sit down, I'll explain very briefly who they are, and then we'll jump into their testimonies. I saw Dr. Centurion over here somewhere. I don't know where he is right now, but I hope he can come up. Okay, so while we wait for Dr. Centurion, joining us remotely, and I don't see him yet, so maybe I'll wait a moment until he appears. To my far right, we have Erping Zhang, Director of Government and Advocacy at the Falun Dafa Information Center, someone I've worked together with for a number of years. To my immediate right, I have Piero Tozzi, Senior Director for China Policy at the America First Policy Institute. Piero was involved in a number of U.S. commissions here, Congressional Executive Commission on China being the one that I think of most often, and has done an incredible amount for the cause of human rights in China, and now very recently has become a senior director for his own shop, so to speak, which is great to see. And we also have, and he'll hopefully be up here any moment, Dr. Alejandro Centurion, neurologist and associate director of medical affairs at Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting. That was an institution that was set up in 2006 to directly challenge this issue. Dr. Centurion, so good to have you here with us. And I guess, are we going to have Dr. Matus, David Matus, join us online? How's that working? Because I don't see him up there yet. So let's start with who we have. Okay. Well, I've asked each of the panelists to prepare, let's say around a 5-minute introduction into their view into the topic. And I will follow that up with some of my own questions for the panel, and then we'll take it to the audience for a broader discussion. So let's start to my immediate right with Piero Tozzi.
Sure. Well, thank you, Jan, and it's always good to be here, and you've really been a thought leader on so much of these issues. Now, I've been asked to address the broad question of how one goes from congressional action to democratic coalition, and I think the question assumes a lot, and it assumes a certain common ground and consensus, which unfortunately I don't think yet exists. I think it first means that we have to be clear-eyed about what we're up against. And big picture, it goes to the nature of our competition with China. I spoke last week at the Oversight Committee about this. What was our competition? And I think it's best understood as a systemic competition, not just simply economic or strategic. And what we mean by this systemic is that the People's Republic of China, under the Chinese Communist Party, seeks to displace the U.S.-led international order and replace it of one of its own devising, to essentially be the hegemon. And what's important about that is that the hegemon sets standards. It's about really standard setting. We see this in many varieties. We see it, for example, in this supporting an alternative global alignment with the BRICS nations, with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. We see it also challenging the U.S. dollar as the dominant currency. We see it as wanting to set standards in technology from communications to AI. But really, I think what's most relevant is how they want to change standards of human rights. And we saw this at 2 years ago, 2024 at the United Nations during China's Universal Periodic Review. They want to move away from this idea of rights as civil and political rights, rights held against the government, to a right to development, collective rights. And this is very germane, I think, to the area of medical ethics, where we see the PRC pushing a normalization effort. They want to keep operating within global international medical institutions, but I think long-term they want to shift ethical understandings. And I think what was illustrative during that hot mic moment last year with Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, where they're talking about living for 150 years, at least for dictators. I don't know about us here, but that idea to push those boundaries requires a new ethics here. Now, I think that message that they wanted, the official message is that, well, we no longer take organs from political prisoners. We rely on voluntary donations. We know from the great work of Jacob Levy and Matthew Robinson in the Journal of Transplantation Studies that the numbers just don't match. There is not a voluntary organ donation system, and systematically they're violating the dead donor rule. But part of this normalization process they seek international recognition. And I think what was really a watershed and something that with very heavy heart, is a symposium that was held in 2017 in Rome, under the auspices of the Pontifical Council for Social Sciences. It was chaired by an Argentine bishop named Marcelo Sanchez Sorondo. Most charitably, I would say that this Bishop Sanchez Sorondo never fully internalized the teachings of the sainted John Paul II in the Gospel of Life, Evangelium Vitae. Now, that symposium was chaired by a doctor, Francis Delmonico, a very credentialed Harvard Medical School surgeon, the president of the Transplantation Society, an advisor to the World Health Organization. And he had invited Huang Jiefu, China's head of we have David Mattis is joining? Okay, so we'll continue.
Let Piero finish, and then we'll introduce
David. To David. But basically, this was, by using credentialed people, it helped enable and accredit China's program to mainstream it. We also see this engagement with medical schools. The Coalition to End Transplant Abuse did a study in 2022 where they identified 37 U.S. institutions, with 14 of them giving clinical training to Chinese doctors in transplant-relevant research. And then building on this, the PRC has sought to market itself as a destination for desperate people that were seeking organs. And really, Jan, you've really spelt it out in Kill to Order, how they play to people's natural human fears. I've also seen videos, and maybe some of you had, how this idea of transplantation is marketed to the Muslim world, especially Gulf countries. They advertise hospitals that have prayer rooms that serve halal food. The irony, of course, is that the CCP persecutes Islam, and the source of these organs really are predominantly Muslim Uyghurs. It's labeled almost as quote-unquote halal organs because they come from people who don't eat pork or drink alcohol. And we also see how insurance systems subsidize this. In Japan, there was a study a couple of years ago by the Ministry of Health, Labor, and Welfare, and they found that 175 Japanese citizens had gone to China, come back to Japan, and their recovery, their aftercare, was subsidized by Japan's insurance system. So we see also, Korea and Japan are source countries here. So I think in many ways, and this is important here because we're among friends, but we delude ourselves if we think that the rest of the world sees things as we do. What should be incontrovertible, first of all, assumes that people are paying attention. Most aren't. And in fact, it is contested. Now, Jan, I think you did give some cause for optimism. There is some optimism, and in fact, your book and also Ethan Gutman's book on the Xinjiang procedure came out. That's good. You mentioned I'd been involved with a number of hearings when I was here with Congressman Chris Smith, including the Congressional Executive Commission on China, Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission. We've seen international intentions for Jeffrey Nice. He convened this along with ETAC. This forum that helped gather evidence. We've also seen legislation introduced in Congress which has not advanced, but on the state level, There are a number of states that have introduced legislation and passed legislation. Texas has been a leader in this. We also see Idaho, Utah, Tennessee, Arizona. And the approach that they take is a little bit different from the congressional approach, and it's something I think that should be considered, and that's targeting insurance. Remember we talked about Japan as how the insurance system covers that. That's also an approach that Taiwan has also taken as well. A number of countries, Israel, Italy, and Taiwan, have also passed legislation. And Taiwan, just this past year, they initiated a prosecution, but they have convicted a doctor for brokering organ harvesting. And when we talk about building an international coalition, TICOT, the Taiwan Association of International Care of Organ Transplants, has really been a leader here. They've presented evidence, they've participated in conferences, but they have also lobbied their legislature. And where there's even loopholes in the law, they've sought to address that. We see also in Korea and Taiwan counterpart organizations, the Korean Association of Ethical Organ Transplants and the Transplant Tourism Research Association in Japan. Both of those things both of those organizations are also doing good work. The key point, though, is we're not where we should be. And while it's important to meet like this, that is not necessarily where the rest of the world is. And as a final point, I would also want to address this question of the whole transplant industry, including in the United States. We do correctly criticize China and the violation of the dead donor rule, for example. But that does leave open a question: when does death begin? And in this country and in the West, beginning in the late 60s and through the 70s and through the 80s, we changed the definition of death. Traditionally, it was cardiopulmonary death was what the definition was. Your heart stops beating, you stop breathing. But we've moved to this idea of brain death. And I think I'll end here, but I think we should really contemplate that amongst ourselves and really ask that very profound question, when does death begin? Because, yes, we do need to address China, but we also, I think, have to look amongst ourselves as well. And with that, I will stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Piero. And I'll just make a quick comment before I introduce David Matus, who's up on the screen. One of the things, when writing Kill to Order, I've also been, at the same time I was contemplating America's and other free nations' deviation from what we consider Hippocratic medicine. So Hippocratic medicine means the medical practitioner treats every person as an individual and tries to do the best for them, right? And while doing the minimal amount of harm with whatever intervention they may choose. Okay, this is a cornerstone of medical ethics traditionally. But there's been a rise in the West of something called utilitarian bioethics, and that's the approach of the greatest good for the greatest number, or perhaps the greatest happiness for the greatest number is another way that's sometimes described. What I realized writing Kill to Order was that really the communist system is sort of the extreme of utilitarian bioethics, because in Communist China, the greatest good is the survival and supremacy of the Chinese Communist Party. So, anything goes. That's why you get atrocity. That's why you get a kill-to-order industry. On that note, allow me to introduce David Matus. David Matus was him and another man named David Kilgore. By the way, David Matus is an international human rights lawyer. David Kilgore was also a lawyer. Now, unfortunately, David Kilgore is no longer with us. He passed away, may he rest in peace. They together wrote a report in 2006 titled Bloody Harvest. And this report was what really opened my eyes to the significant amount of evidence that already existed at the time to show that this forced organ harvesting from prisoners of conscience at scale was real. So David Matus is going to speak about the legal architecture, if you will, of what accountability might look like. David, let me pass it to you. We need to unmute.
There, can you hear me now?
We got hear you loud and clear.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Yeah, I've talked about accountability in different contexts, and I thought what I'd look at here is the Chinese government official statements on organ harvesting and how they shifted and how they really are doing everything to avoid accountability for obvious reasons. The whole dissimulation of the Chinese government didn't start in a reaction to our report. It started before that. Because the Chinese government has been sourcing organs from prisoners from the very beginning, from the 1980s. The original sourcing was from prisoners sentenced to death and then executed, and then they switched to prisoners sentenced to death and then executed them from organ extraction. There was a 2001 testimony in the United States Congress by one of the doctors who was familiar what was going on in China at the time, and he testified to this sourcing of organs from prisoners, and the Chinese government in 2001 it said what this testimony was. It was that it was a lie, and it was preposterous, and they said everything is sensational lies, vicious slander. That's what they said. With regard to the trade in human organs, China strictly prohibits that. And yet at the time, in 2001, they didn't even have a donation system. They didn't have an organ distribution system. You couldn't donate organs unless there was a near relative. So it was just completely divorced from the truth. There was a statements that started coming out before our report, which actually prompted us to do our report, David Kilgore and me, in March 9th, 2006, a Japanese reporter with the pseudonym Peter said he'd interviewed people who talked of abuse in Sujiatan Hospital in Shenyang City in Linnang Province in China. And then another woman, her ex-husband Annie, she said he'd been harvesting organs from corneas from the Falun Gong practitioners in this case, and the other doctors have been harvesting other organs. The Falun Gong were being killed through organ extraction. Their bodies were cremated. The organs were sold to transplant tourists. Chinese government denied that. They continue to insist everything was coming from donations. They then issued interim regulations in March 2006 saying transplantation could come only from registered hospitals and asked hospitals to apply. They organized visits suitably after everything was cleaned up at the Sujiatan Hospital with various people who might be interested who saw nothing. Our report came out then in July 2006 about what was going on. And then at the end of 2006, the government changed its narrative. They said, well, not everything's coming from donations. In fact, everything's coming from prisoners, but or almost everything, but they're coming from prisoners who donated their organs before they were executed to atone for the crimes that they committed. The regulations of the interim ones of 2006 and the final ones of 2007 set up a registration system for hospitals. And they registered 167 hospitals which could do transplants. But what was striking was that they had requirements, and they had over 1,000 hospitals that applied, which meant that, which supposedly met the requirements. And so it indicated the extent of transplantation that was going on. And the registration system didn't account for military hospitals, which, because the health ministry didn't control them, and they were doing transplants that were available not just to the military, but to the public and transplant tourists, and there was a large number of those. And as well, the hospitals that were doing transplants applied for registration and didn't get registered, continued to do transplants. There's reports of patients going to these hospitals and reporting afterwards where they went and how it was more secretive than it used to be, but was still functioning. In 2011, China set up a China Organ Transplant Response System where organs were put into a computer system. I mean, what we see over the time is, I'm mentioning all these changes because what they do is they see, China sees that people can observe the abuse, and they try to improve the system of deniability to make it more plausible than it was before. So up until 2015, from 2000 to 2015, their official stance was everything's coming from the prisoners sentenced to death. But this raised a lot of opposition from the Transplantation Society, who weren't doing any investigations, but were prepared to accept what China was saying, but didn't agree with it, and said you can't source from prisoners sentenced to death because they're not, the donations aren't really voluntary, even if they say they're voluntary, even if you say they're voluntary. And then there was a transplantation conference in 2014 in San Francisco where the Chinese applicants weren't allowed to attend, and there was an international transplant conference in China, in Hangzhou in China, the same year, where the international community didn't attend. And this got the government to move, at least in their narrative. And then in December 14, they went back to their original story, sort of, that everything's coming from donations, starting January 15th. And they're going to stop sourcing organs from prisoners. But it was very ambiguous what they said in 2014, because they said that prisoners sentenced to death could still donate through the 2011 computerized organ supply system. And also, like I mentioned, that transplantation in China started with prisoners in the 1980s. And in 1984, they even had a law that said they could source organs from prisoners without their consent, with consent of their family, as long as the bodies were unclaimed. And when the government announced they were switching back to donations, at least in their narrative, they said that this 1984 law, because it became kind of a tacit acknowledgement, an unspoken rule that those were their words, that using the organs without their consent or the consent of their families is acceptable to ease the demand in the market. Well, that's what they said, and they published in a Chinese communist publication, and with the implication, of course, that they were going to remove the law, but they never did. It's still there. Then there was this Korean documentary in 2017 where a Korean network went undercover with a patient to a hospital in China to see what was going on with the transplant. It was booked in advance, and they get to the hospital, and the patient starts negotiating with the hospital about getting the organ quicker for more money, the negotiation concludes. He pays more money, he gets the organ faster, and this is all part of the documentary. I've been attending a number of these transplantation conferences, basically to try to get the transplantation profession to do more about organ transplant abuse than they have been doing. And so I went to one in 2018, like right after the documentary, and to make a presentation. And one of the attendees was Wang Heibo, who's number 2 in the Chinese transplant system. And he gave a presentation, and there was a question and answer. And I asked him, what's your reaction to this Korean documentary? And so his answer was that the woman that they caught on screen who was negotiating with the patient about the price of the organ has now disappeared, and the Chinese police system is after her, as if, I mean, the whole problem was just her. But obviously, the problem couldn't just be her, because she was alone not responsible for getting the organ and transplanting the organ. I mean, it was a kind of a patently ridiculous answer. But in any case, what we see going from 2001 to the present is constant denial, shifting narrative, implausible denials. And it's basically they're trying to. I mean, it's not just what they say, but the way they rejig the system. The gullible might think, well, the laws have changed, the problem's gone. But the function of the change in the law is just to make their denials more plausible than they were before. And I think when you're talking about accountability, I mean, you obviously have to put the case forward about the problem, but you also have to see what the other side is saying. And when you see what the other side is saying is so implausible, ridiculous, shifting, incredible, then that really says something about what's going on in China. So that's what I will say for now. And thanks for listening.
Thank you, David. So let's do Erping Zhang next, and that's just talking about how this forced organ harvesting is a kind of logical product of the system.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay. Thank you for having me here. It's truly a delight to be reunited with David again. Back in 2006, David Mattis and David Kilgore, and we started, quite a bit work here and work with the Congress. And I believe Congressman Dana Rohrabacher held the first hearing for us. In the United States, and also three of us traveled to Australia, Europe, and many countries to raise awareness, including Japan. And it was a challenging time back then because a lot of people have questions about this, especially it's a state-sanctioned act. But over time, your effort really made a huge difference. So really, I feel very bad that Kilgore is no longer with us. But, the work you guys did was unbelievable. I wish to bring the audience to the attention of the work done by the China Tribunal in 2019, chaired by Sir Jeffrey Nice, who was the prosecutor of ICC. He did a successful prosecution of the former head of Yugoslavia, and he took up this work, and the conclusion was massive, that the forced organ harvesting taking place, Falun Gong being the largest community of the victims. What really attracted me about this China Tribunal actually was a testimonial by a former New York Times reporter, Didi Tadlow, who was a Beijing-based reporter, and she had lunch with surgeons. And she found out there was something fishy, and she was trying to do the story on this because the surgeons confessed to her, about taking organs from, people alive. So she wrote this testimonial for the China Tribunal, and she was told to shut up, and she then left New York Times. And this is interesting because you see mainstream media, instead of exposing the crime against humanity, they are trying to silence their own reporter about this evil act. Today, I wish to focus on the transnational repression by the CCP, here in North America.
a few years back, China's Ministry of Public Security and State Security has set up a North American office, especially designated to supervise the transnational repression on the Falun Gong community. They have the seal. We have, on the internet, you can find out the appointment letter for the guy who is going to be heading this office. And since then, we have seen typically three things happened just for the Falun Gong community. Number one would be the weaponization of the democratic institution, especially the legal system. They are trying to use, influence the institutions, legal system, public institutions, regulatory process, become the targets for abuse through coordinated litigation, politically motivated complaints, harassment intended to drain the resource of targeted communities. It's not just Falun Gong, but other groups too. So the objective is often not necessarily to prevail in court, but to impose financial costs, damage reputation, discourage participation, and silence critics. So the democratic legal system should remain open and impartial, but they must also remain vigilant against manipulation by foreign powers such as China. Specifically, the CCP is really weaponizing our legal system to prosecute our American communities and citizens. The second thing that we see, the Chinese transnational repression effort will be they try to use our free press platform. The open society cherishes the freedom press because truth ultimately depends on free inquiry. The CCP exploits that openness. So disinformation campaigns, coordinated influence operations, manipulated narratives seek to shape public opinion and at the same time obscuring the role of the CCP in directing these efforts. According to Harvard professor Gary King, the Chinese regime used its trolls to fabricate at least estimated 448 million fake social media comments annually. So the target is not just Falun Gong alone, but the target is public trust itself. So the third thing will be over the past few years, we have seen increasing threats, bomb threats, mass shooting threats towards the Falun Gong communities, towards the Shenyun Performing Arts and theaters like Kennedy Center, which was in the news. They received bomb threats and from agents threatening to stop the Shenyun Performing Arts. There are also threats targeted at the elected officials, including President Trump and Prime Minister of UK and Australia, and the members of Congress who supported the Falun Gong. So when foreign actors seek to frighten Americans on U.S. soil, this is no longer merely a human rights issue. It's really a national security issue. So why should this matter to the Americans and the United States? Some people may ask, why should Congress and government care? The answer is very simple. When Communist China successfully intimidates religious believers in America today, the journalists may be the next, universities may be the next. We already have Confucius institutes. Some, they change different forms, even in high schools. And human rights advocates may be next. The methods perfected against one community rarely remain confined to one community. History shows us the communist influence expands unless confronted. So protecting Falun Gong, therefore, is not just about granting special treatment. It's about defending constitutional freedoms for everyone. So it's about preserving the integrity of our courts, not to be, used by the foreign powers against American citizens. It's also about protecting the freedom of religion and free speech. So it's really about ensuring the foreign government cannot conduct campaigns of intimidation inside our United States in our backyard. So I'll stop there and.
Wonderful. Dr. Centurion, please.
Thank you very much for having me here as a representative of Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting. First, I do want to congratulate Jan on your book, Killed Order. It's an excellent review of this topic. I encourage everyone to read it. From our perspective, this book is going to play a big role in helping to do what's essential to bring these crimes to an end, which is more awareness. There's still just a lack of awareness, and this book is going to play a big role in that. Just briefly, just to mention, I first heard about these crimes in 2006, like many of our members here, when the Kilgore Matus report came out, and I had a hard time believing it at first. I was particularly connected to it in some way in that I've had two members of my family, my brother and my mother, had one a liver transplant, one a kidney transplant. And if done ethically, it's a gift of life, it's a wonderful thing. But I could not believe that physicians were participating in these type of crimes, and only after looking at the data, have I become fully convinced. And DAFOH has been trying to raise awareness since 2006. So as we know, this is one of the gravest violations of medical ethics in the 21st century. It really represents the ultimate corruption of medicine. It transforms a profession dedicated to preserving life into an instrument of persecution, and the physician from healer into executioner. So why, after more than 2 decades of accumulated evidence, does it still continue? Despite the fact that there's been even more evidence accumulated, what we're seeing is that the response from the medical community has weakened during this time. I'd like to argue that there's 3 main factors, amongst others. One is what we call weaponization of medicine, the verification trap, and as others have already discussed, institutional normalization. This first concept of weaponized medicine refers to the transformation of medicine from a profession dedicated to healing into an instrument of state persecution. Forced organ harvesting is often viewed within the transplant community, in part, a human rights or political issue, and therefore outside the proper scope of transplant medicine. China routinely characterizes its human rights record as political when challenged, and over time, that framing has increasingly seeped into Western academic and medical discourse, but this is a fundamentally flawed concept. In the case of forced organ harvesting, medicine is not merely witnessing persecution, it's become its main instrument. Transplant medicine cannot extricate itself from this reality, no matter how uncomfortable this truth is. As we discussed, the Chinese Communist parties persecuted numerous religious and ethnic minorities, and including Falun Gong, Uyghurs, Tibetans, and it was the millions of Falun Gong practitioners, the flooded labor camps, that became the source that fueled this initial transplant explosion in China. It became a multi-billion-dollar industry. And the system is parasitic. The incentive of the Chinese party state was to eliminate the very victims it had first dehumanized through state propaganda. Religious persecution came first, and eliminating Falun Gong was the primary objective. It was only later that China's hospitals and transplant surgeons recognized the enormous financial incentives provided by the vast pool of victims supplied by the state, and these incentives have continued to drive forced organ harvesting. This is what makes forced organ harvesting fundamentally different from most other human rights abuses. Once medicine becomes an instrument of persecution, and once physicians become participants, as in part of what, as the China Tribunal states, a crime against humanity, it no longer is a political or human rights responsibility. It becomes the medical ethics responsibility, and one that every doctor should find intolerable. Moving on to the next concept is the verification trap. The verification trap is a paradox in which the regime accused of crimes against humanity controls the very evidence needed to verify those crimes, allowing the absence of verification become the justification for an action. It's further reinforced when the statements and assurances of an authoritarian regime, masters in lies and deception such as China, are afforded greater credibility than the independent evidence challenging them. This creates a dangerous double standard. Official claims of reform are accepted on limited evidence, while allegations of crimes against humanity are held to an evidentiary standard that the regime itself prevents the international community from ever satisfying. For policymakers within the international transplant community in organizations such as the WHO, this makes it far easier to justify continued engagement than to make the difficult and ethical policy decisions required when confronting a powerful authoritarian regime. Under intense international pressure, we know that China in 2015 stated that they would no longer use executed criminals and rely on only voluntary donation. However, these evaluations, but the evaluations that were ultimately carried out by the WHO and transplant societies were not comprehensive. There's never been unrestricted, independent audit of Chinese transplant centers. Only guided, prearranged visits to approximately 20 of China's 169 authorized transplant centers. There's never been complete transparency and traceability, the two principles that underpin every ethical transplant system. China has also never acknowledged persecuting the minorities and victims, despite the substantial amount of evidence we have. So reform is not the same as independent verification. And it's also important to note that no authoritarian regime accused of crimes against humanity has ever voluntarily opened its institutions to unrestricted outside inspection. China controls the hospitals, the military hospitals, detention facilities, the donor registries, medical records, and access for investigators and journalists. Independent verification is therefore not merely difficult, it's structurally almost impossible. Under these circumstances, insisting upon unrestricted verification before taking meaningful action unintentionally rewards the secrecy itself. If independent verification becomes the prerequisite for action, the perpetrator only needs to prevent independent verification, as China has successfully done for years. The third concept, as others have already discussed, is the institutional normalization. Institutional normalization is the gradual process by which continued scientific engagement causes unresolved ethical concerns to recede from professional discourse, not because they've been resolved, but because they've become increasingly accepted as part of the status quo. Scientific collaboration, conference participation, professional relationships, and the desire to preserve engagement with Chinese institutions all create a subtle but powerful incentive to avoid public confrontation. Over time, institutional silence itself becomes normalized, and routine scientific exchange creates the impression that the underlying ethical questions have already been answered. I'd like to share some experience from doctors of forced organ harvesting on this evolution. At the 2014 San Francisco International World Transplant Congress, several members of our organization published a landmark paper in the American Transplant Journal that really helped stimulate the international discussion regarding China's forced organ harvesting practices. Since 2015, after China announced its reforms, however, the willingness of transplant conferences to engage openly with the issue has steadily diminished. Our application for exhibits at the 2025 World Transplant Congress, again in San Francisco, and the 2026 American Transplant Congress in in Boston this year, were initially accepted, but ultimately rejected, citing changes in conference priorities. Despite all the continued evidence we have since 2015, such as the China Tribunal, United Nations reports, and others. This represents more than institutional normalization. It's the censoring of discussion on forced organ harvesting. When professional societies increasingly exclude discussion of an unresolved ethical issue despite the continued emergence of credible evidence, they suppress legitimate scientific and ethical discourse. Open inquiry, critical debate, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable evidence are fundamental principles of both science and medicine. When those discussions are discouraged or excluded, they undermine the very values upon which our profession depends. Perhaps the most troubling observation at this year when I attended the conference in Boston was that many physicians, especially surgical residents, were unfamiliar with one of these most significant transplant abuses of our time. During the meeting, I spoke with a highly respected transplant surgeon who has served in a leadership role within one of the major international transplant societies. When I asked why discussion of forced organ harvesting had largely disappeared, he acknowledged that many within the leadership believed it is time to move beyond the issue. They believe China has reformed its transplant system, despite also acknowledging that full comprehensive independent verification has not taken place. That conversation reinforced for me how institutional normalization occurs, not through proof that ethical concerns have been resolved, but through the gradual acceptance that they no longer warrant continued scrutiny. Ironically, many sectors of Western society have become increasingly skeptical of engagement with China. Governments, businesses, and national security institutions now openly acknowledge long-standing concern regarding transparency and state deception, having learned those lessons the very hard way. Yet much of the transplant community has moved in the opposite direction, increasingly accepting official assurances from China despite unresolved concerns regarding independent verification. Perhaps this difference exists because most physicians do not feel personally affected by China's deception in the same way that governments and businesses have. Many physicians understandably regard crimes against humanity as matters of law, diplomacy, or politics. Forced organ harvesting is fundamentally different. Once physicians become the individuals killing prisoners of conscience for their organs, once the medical scalpel becomes an instrument of execution rather than healing, medicine itself becomes an instrument of persecution. Other professions may lose markets. Medicine has not yet fully realized it risks losing something far greater, its moral soul. Taiwan and a path forward. Since this forum focuses on U.S.-Taiwan relationships, it's important to recognize Taiwan's leadership in confronting these abuses. After evidence emerged that Taiwanese patients were traveling to China for transplantation, Taiwan strengthened its Human Transplant Act in 2015. Rather than prohibiting overseas transplantation, Taiwan emphasized transparency by requiring documentation of overseas transplants and prohibiting participation in organ trafficking, coercion, or transplantation without documenting informed consent. These reforms have been associated with a substantial decline in transplant tourism and demonstrated that transparency can be strengthened without restricting legitimate access to transplantation. The United States currently lacks a comparable reporting mechanism, and it's part of the reason we do not know exactly how many Americans may be traveling to China now. Although HIPAA protects patient privacy, it does not prevent confidential reporting systems similar to those that already are used for communicable diseases or for example, suspected child abuse. Laws requiring a confidential national registry for transplant tourism could improve surveillance, research, and transparency while still protecting patient confidentiality. From the perspective of Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting, the most significant legislation currently before Congress is Senate Bill 4009. Beyond authorizing sanctions against those involved in forced organ harvesting, the legislation will require the first comprehensive U.S. government assessment of China's transplant policies and practices. Such a report would provide an independent foundation for future policy and make it considerably more difficult to dismiss these concerns as lacking evidence or politically motivated. Perhaps most importantly, it would serve as a powerful antidote to the institutional normalization that has increasingly paralyzed much of the international transplant community. What should we do then? The first priority is education. China has been remarkably successful in suppressing discussion of forced organ harvesting, and awareness remains surprisingly low among both physicians and the general public. We must continue educating medical students, physicians, transplant societies, medical licensing boards, professional associations, governments, and the public. Greater awareness will lead to stronger legislation, greater accountability, and renewed ethical leadership. I also encourage everyone to read the annual report published by Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting and to watch our new documentary, Silent Harvest. Awareness remains our most effective response to the silence created by the Chinese Communist Party's censorship. deception, and obfuscation. History will not judge the medical profession solely by whether it demanded perfect evidence. It will also judge whether it responded appropriately to overwhelming evidence of an ongoing crime against humanity when obtaining perfect evidence was rendered impossible by the very regime accused of committing it. The pursuit of perfect evidence must never become an excuse for moral paralysis. The ethical standard for medicine is not the evidentiary standard of a criminal court. Physicians are entrusted to prevent harm, protect human life, and defend human dignity, not simply to document atrocities after every doubt has been eliminated. When compelling evidence points to an ongoing crime against humanity and independent verification is deliberately obstructed, our obligation is not to lower our ethical guard, but to heighten it, to resist institutional normalization, maintain ethical vigilance, and continue demanding transparency, accountability, and independent verification. These are the responsibilities of every medical professional, and we must make sure this is of utmost importance. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Centurion. A couple of comments, and then I'll go to David Matus about the kind of legalities. So I was just in Taiwan fairly recently. There was a hearing in the legislature about forced organ harvesting in China, and it had been triggered by a successful application of this law that Dr. Centurion just mentioned. Actually, Pierre, I think you mentioned it as well. There was a doctor who was brokering transplants in communist China. He was found guilty of doing this. I think he ended up with a 2-year suspended sentence. Not the best, obviously. It would be nice to have it longer, but he also has been stripped of his medical license for life. And this is the first such prosecution that I'm aware of internationally. So I think Taiwan is actually not just leading on the legal side in this respect, but also in the prosecutions. So that was very good to see. I was actually also recently up in London in Parliament. David Matus and I were speaking about this forced organ harvesting, and he was talking about how to augment the existing statutes in the UK. So why don't we bring that idea here back to the US? I've been thinking about this idea of the verification trap that Dr. Centurion mentioned, and this obviously creates this persistent problem around evidence, even though, as you famously said, David, the problem with the evidence that there's too much, not too little. I'm wondering, we have this legislation that Dr. Centurion mentioned, S4009. We have another bill in the House, HR 1503, if I recall, both very strong pieces of legislation, a good sort of beginnings. We have 6 states in the United States that have enacted legislation to prevent insurance and Medicare and Medicaid for paying for transplants. So there's all this kind of stuff happening. What do you think the best bet is for strengthening the legal architecture of accountability, David? And I think we need the unmute again.
Okay, I've unmuted myself. I think what we need is, rather than just one thing, what we need is a comprehensive system. As you mentioned, in the U.S., there's some laws about insurance, which are useful. 6 states, should be more states. There's some legislation in Congress. The Congress legislation is about sanctions. It's about visas. It's about reporting of state reporting of abuse in foreign countries, which is useful. In England, there's 20 countries now that have made complicity in organ transplant abuse an extraterritorial offense. That's important. The United Kingdom has also required health professionals to report transplant abuse abroad to the health administration system. That's important. Taiwan has got a system of hospital reporting, that hospitals have to report when there's transplant abuse abroad to the government system. Israel's got an inspection system so that the inspector can, from the government, can inspect hospital records, and they also deny insurance to people who've traveled abroad and got transplants in a form that's not consistent with local law. The Americans are proposing passport denial to Americans who've gone abroad for transplant abuse, and so and I would say that all of these various legislative initiatives are useful, and what's important is we have not just one of them, but all of them, because I mean, obviously, for change in China, it's the Chinese who got to change, but for change in any one of these countries, for complicity in what's going on in China, it's totally up to each one of these countries to do something. And I mean, there's 192 countries now, so maybe we've got 20 or 25 countries that have got legislation or initiatives, but transplant tourism, of course, can come from anywhere, and the demand far exceeds the supply, and so what you've got in China is a market where the supply seems inexhaustible, because they've got this huge number of arbitrarily indefinitely detained prisoners of conscience. And what's more, it's spreading because, I mean, initially it was prisoners sentenced to death, and then it was primarily in Falun Gong, and now the numbers of Uyghurs are huge, and other minority populations are very worried. And China is actively trying to export its system and get other countries to do the same thing. And what's more, the technology in transplantation has developed to the point where it's possible now for organs to live longer or survive longer after death or after brain death than it was before, because these extracorporeal membrane oxygenation machines, ECMO machines, and because of refrigeration techniques, and because obviously of quicker flights and so on. And so what you've got is not just a continuing problem, but an accelerating problem. And we can't wait, as a previous speaker has indicated, till the problem is still to wait till they start coming to after us for our organs to do something about it. It's got to be done much earlier than that. And so if you ask for laws, what should be done, I would say we've got lots of examples, lots of precedents. They're all isolated, they're all valuable, and all of them should be implemented everywhere.
Thank you. I was told there would be some kind of timing happening in the back, because I just want to be sure that we don't run too far over. I think there's probably still a lot of questions I need to ask and the audience will want to ask. So it'd be good to know how much time we have left ultimately. I want to jump to Dr. Centurion. So one of the things I've had some discussions with people in the U.S. administration who are interested in trying to challenge this through some of the existing statute or through their agencies and so forth. And so I guess the question is, I mean, you alluded to some of this in your talk, beyond laws, right, we want to build some kind of structure where it's not just condemning, and in the face of that, this kind of normalizations when people get tired of not having enough evidence or not being able to say something, to actually, building systems that will prevent people from being parts of these supply chains, these illicit supply chains, which China does at such a large scale under the Communist Party.
So the question exactly is how
can we build a structure, beyond the laws, right, to help people not become part of this, or for the people who have very, very loose morals and might want to become part of it, to disincentivize them from participating?
Disincentivize the Chinese surgeons you're referring to, or
the patients?
The patients when traveling there. I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay. I personally feel that awareness is just number one. There's just a lack of awareness about these crimes. I'll just talk about the fact when in my hospital, I've spoken to nurses, doctors, and I would say about 20% of people have heard about this or and many of them have a very superficial understanding of it. So the lack of awareness is a huge problem because of the silencing, the propaganda from the CCP, the deception, and the lack of media coverage in the media. I think that people, if they knew about this, particularly someone who's going to travel for organs to China, if they knew the implications of that, granted, some may still not have the moral qualms about it, but I think the vast majority would. So you have that aspect of awareness and just elevating a person's consciousness to know what's happening. You don't necessarily, I think, have to force them by a law to not go, because the other countries that as we talk about in Taiwan have been successful in doing so. I think the medical system has to be transparent. I think having information, as I mentioned, about how many Americans are traveling there would be helpful for lawmakers and policymakers. All these aspects I think are important, but ultimately this needs to be made aware at a much larger scale. Despite 20 years, too few people have heard about it or know about forced organ harvesting. And I commend your paper and your work, what you've done, because you've been one of the most effective in doing so and keeping the discourse going.
Jan, I wonder if I could maybe add to that a bit.
Please.
I wouldn't say that the prevention and the law are alternatives. I think they can work together, because if you have a law that says complicity in organ transplant abuse abroad is a crime, and a law that says transplant tourist patients have to be reported to the authorities, anybody who needs a transplant, the treating physician can say, if you go abroad and you get involved in an organ transplant abuse, you will be committing a crime. And if you need aftercare, as transplant patients do need aftercare, when you come back and you need aftercare, we will give you aftercare, but we will have to report you to the authorities for what you've done. And that in itself would be, just telling patients that would be an important deterrence to traveling abroad for transplants in abusive situations.
And just following up on that point, many people do equate law and morality, but essentially I think we do have, as a fundamental issue, a moral issue here. And I don't know if people are following what just is happening in California, where the legislature there has really crossed an ethical line. You've gone from the taking of human life before birth, abortion, to essentially a infanticide in that first month now. So it was Solzhenitsyn who said that the good and evil runs through the heart, to speak of organs here. Fundamentally, this is an issue, and I did, highlight that Vatican conference, that Bishop Marcelo Sanchez Serrando was involved in, and why that was so significant, because you're getting an implicit moral imprimatur, whereas the importance of the Catholic Church and that witness in St. John Paul and Benedict talking about building a culture of life there, it really it's something that you cannot just address in law. Yes, we do have to have laws. Yes, I think what a lot of the states are doing through the insurance system is a good way, and the immunosuppressants that people need, the aftercare, that's one way, as Professor Mattis just said. But fundamentally here we have a moral issue that we look at certain trends in society that are trending in the wrong direction. So I think that's where moral voices, including the Falun Gong voices, need to speak out, and speak out in a universal way, not just with particular, just the Falun Gong or whatnot, but really speak more broadly, because this is a societal, moral issue ultimately.
So I argued in an op-ed in the Baltimore Sun last year that basically it's our deep engagement with communist China. We had this idea that we were going to change them. Back 20, 25 years ago, everybody believed this, that by putting a lot of money, a lot of cash into communist China, of course taking a bit for ourselves as we did it, would, change China, liberalize it, and so forth. Of course, this was sort of a subterfuge, if you will. The effect has been in the other direction, but also around this question of medical ethics, right? And this rise of this very utilitarian, instrumentalized view of human beings, not seen as having innate dignity, but just being part of some sort of larger collective apparatus, right? This is your Piero, you were talking about this sort of uptick in the view of the collective rights. Now, one thing the HHS last year did decertify to U.S. transplant systems because they were getting too liberal with their application of the dead donor rule. They were basically using people for organs that shouldn't have been used. I just heard actually from someone at HHS last night that they've decertified a third one, at least one more now. So there is this sort of thing is happening, like the knowledge that there are problems in the system, that we can't keep moving in that direction, that exists, but perhaps it needs a lot more. I want to jump to Erping. So you explain, it's very hard for people to imagine the level of what we call in the human rights field transnational repression in America by the Chinese regime, right? We're supposed to have powerful safeguards around that. And I guess the thing this forced organ harvesting fits squarely into that, but it's not necessarily in the most obvious way. And so I just wanted to get you to comment on that a little bit as well, in this vein that we've been just discussing.
There are two aspects. The first one is right now the CCP is in our backyard. They were able to target any group they want, that disagree with their policy or anything. They target individuals, communities. They can use I mentioned the free the press platform. They work. I just mentioned one example of New York Times reporter, failed to report it because of the suppression by the editor. Then you have they are infiltrating our institution and through fear and coercion. So we face, it's not Falun Gong alone, it's actually everyone is at risk right now. In terms of the forced organ harvesting or the transnational repression or the COVID pandemic, whatever military, they even have balloon, flying over our territory, above the United States, airspace, and you have open aggression here. They even, threatened to bomb the Kennedy Center here in Washington, D.C., right before Trump, visit to the Kennedy Center. So you have such open, aggressive, acts by the CCP. So what we do, legislation, all these kind of things are very good. They can deter, all the CCP's assault on our sovereignty, in fact. They are actually conducting terrorist act. It's a state terrorist act on the U.S. soil. And it's not just a repression acts. So in the long term, how do we stop all these, acts? Not just in the United States, in Europe, in Canada. They have police station in New York City. So what else? In the long term, we should seek ways to bring about social change in China. That can really put an end to all the, the preventive, measures, legislation, or, others. It will be good for the regional stability in Taiwan. It will be good for world peace and prosperity. It's even better for the Chinese people. So what we should have done long been doing is to engage with the Chinese people, not the Chinese regime, because the CCP does not equal to the Chinese people. It does not equal to China or Chinese culture. And for democracy to function, you need two elements. One is mass participation in the democratic process. The second one is you need informed citizens to participate in this process. And if we are able to bring down the Chinese firewall, if Chinese people know as much as we do, not just about outside of China, but their own situation in China, because they don't know. I've met lots of people, Chinese students on American campus. They have never heard of Tiananmen massacre. They have never heard of the Wuhan virus stories. So if we are able to inform the Chinese people, they will bring about social change on their own because they will not live with that. So the Chinese people are victims of this communist system. They are greater victims. The organs are being harvested. So if we are able to find a way to bring down the firewall, to engage with civil society, the Chinese people, rather than, for many Chinese people and the Chinese Americans will see the communication between the leadership of the Communist Party and here overseas, other countries. But if we see the engagement with the Chinese people, with the Chinese civil society, with the vast majority, identify with their own interests, then things will change. Thus, fundamentally changing is ensuring world, peace and prosperity and freedom. And that's, free China is good for everyone. And we don't have to pass the legislation anymore. We don't have to, do all this, spending millions of dollars on missiles. So that's probably the best way looking forward.
Yeah, Jan, I wonder if I could add to that as well.
Please.
Those are a couple of issues that are quite important and quite broad. Transnational repression isn't just an organ harvesting issue, and it isn't just even a China issue. There's many unfortunate regimes which engage in transnational repression. Moreover, there's no legislation, as far as I know, anywhere against it. There's legislation about foreign interference, but usually that foreign interference legislation deals with interference in elections, interference with parliaments or Congress, but not repression of diasporas. There needs to be a much more serious global focus. There's now a G7 resolution, a European Parliament resolution, but these are just policy statements. They're not laws. I've seen it myself in dealing with this issue of forced organ harvesting, because there's many a venue where I couldn't get a booking, or I got a booking, or David Kilgore got a booking, and then it was canceled. Often we were told it was because it was double booking, the room was not available. We'd go to the rooms later and they were empty. And there was many places where we were given a booking and remained, and we were told that the Chinese consulate or embassy or the Chinese Student Association or whether the Confucius Institute had asked for it to be canceled. So, that's been very common. And other activities that have been associated with the Falun Gong community. With Shenyang, the dance company, the attempts to cancel venues through the consulates and embassies of China are systematic, global. And so that's a perpetual problem. And I think, as I say, it's a much bigger problem. It's not bigger in terms of deaths and so on, but it's bigger in terms of global reach than forced organ harvesting. And so it needs a much more comprehensive approach to it. In terms of how we get change in China, I certainly think that information is useful, but I think there has to be more than that. I think there has to be costs for China to what it's doing, some forms of pressure. I think the fact that in 2014 the Chinese weren't allowed to come to the transplantation conference or make presentations, and that the internationals didn't go to a Chinese conference. That made more of a difference to the Chinese system than the information that was produced about their abuse. And so if they're ostracized, isolated, sanctioned, prevented in a variety of different ways from going about what they want to do, that form of pressure can have an impact on them even beyond all the information that's available. So I would add that as well.
And just on that note, there is one very prominent international transplant organization, the International Society for Heart and Lung Transplantation, which has an official position that it believes this is real and it refuses all transplant literature. It takes no papers from China because of this. And I think it's a very significant development. It would be great to see every international transplant association take that position. Of course, these things aren't taken lightly because, as David pointed out, this is the thing in a way that the Chinese regime hates the most, is basically being called out prominently by prominent institutions. But Pierre, you were going to say something.
Well, I'll say, while Dr. Mattis is correct that the transnational repression legislation here in Congress is stalled, we are seeing action at the state level. And again, Texas, which led on the organ harvesting legislation, has passed transnational repression legislation, and other states are considering that as well, Michigan. I think it's important, though, and you'd asked the question, are we becoming more like them? The whole theory behind engagement was we engage and they'll, quote unquote, become more like us. Actually, Dr. Francis Delmonico, that was one of his rationale that we talked about on there. He said that we can't isolate them, but we need to engage, right? But we also have to think, this is, the CCP is, yes, it's a Leninist system, but it's also a legalist, right? A legalist system as well. And if you look at legalism, this notion of rewards and punishments, transnational repression is a punishment, but we also have to look at that rewards aspect. And what does the CCP do to induce people to conform to it? They use money to seduce and to compromise. They use sex, but they also use access to organs. And, Taiwan should be praised, but it took a while to get there, even when the legislation was passed in 2015, because you had a lot of people that were compromised because, maybe elderly parents went to China, and it did take some change. There was Peter Zhang, who was at the Control Yen, Zhenchai Yen, did some groundbreaking work there in Taiwan to try to push that issue, but there was resistance to him. So one way to think about access to organs is as a reward if you you comply with what the CCP demands. It's easier. It's like the cartels say, plato o plombo, silver or lead. You agree with us, we'll give you silver. You disagree, you get a lead bullet. So that has been another thing too. And again, I think we really need to look inwardly. It's important to pass legislation, but the Roman historian Tacitus said, a superabundance of laws is a sure sign of a civilization in decay. Ultimately, it is moral. If you look at Confucius believed in lawlessness, in the sense that if you had a people that were grounded in morality, you don't need the laws. So again, I think the problem here is fundamentally a moral issue that we have to address here at home and elsewhere as well. Thank you.
Just a final comment before we get a few audience questions. By the way, if you would like to ask a question, please come up to these two microphones here. We're going to be able to ask a couple. Hopefully they'll be quick. But my comment, this reminds me of something after this hot mic moment that was briefly discussed here. There was, basically, I'll paraphrase what was said, okay? Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, and Kim Jong-un are in Tiananmen Square watching a military parade. They're mic'd up by Chinese Central Television, and this gets caught and broadcast around the world by Reuters, I think. And so, to make a long story short, Xi says to Putin, when we're 70, we're just babies, right? They're just over 70. Putin responds and says, through continual organ transplantation, I'm paraphrasing here, we can achieve immortality. Through continual organ transplantation, perhaps we can achieve immortality. And then she responds, our target's 150 years, or we think we can reach 150 years. So this was an allusion to their elite longevity project, Project 9081, topic for another day. But the point is here that if you're a Chinese super elite, this system gives you unlimited, on-demand access to organs in perpetuity. Okay, that is a very extreme reality. Of course, you have to be able to be morally challenged sufficiently to take advantage of that. There's even an obituary I was sent some years ago where basically the vice minister, I believe, was known to brag about how many organs he had transplanted. And this was actually creepily written into the obituary. I don't know what to say, it exists. Some people told me after this, some Chinese actually told me, I don't think it's possible this could have been a real hot mic moment, right? They said, no, there's no way. The CCP is way too organized. Think of the heads that would have rolled if this was actually a hot mic moment, right? These top leaders being caught saying something they didn't want out there. So this person said to me, I think it's advertising. I think they're calling out to these other people who are similarly morally challenged. If you want to work with us, we have access to this, so you better be on our team, right? And then you can have access to our organs. So anyway, it's a horrible concept for me. I don't know I tend to believe it was actually a hot mic moment, but this is something that I was told by not just one person actually afterwards. So let's see. We don't have people coming up to the microphones. Oh wait, there's one person coming. Okay. Oh, two people. Okay. Please. Oh, ma'am, and please, I have a few requests. Please identify yourself, your affiliation, and also please make sure to keep it a question. Sometimes there can be long statements. Yeah.
My name is Elisa Zhou. I'm an accountant living in Maryland. So thank you all for your work in disclosing and raising awareness of the crime of forced organ harvesting in communist China. So as ordinary U.S. citizens, what we can do to help stop this?
I'll just make one quick comment. So I did write this book, Killed to Order. It's at killtoorder.com if you're interested in checking it out. It looks at a lot of this work that's been done in the past. But in the back of that book, I have an appendix which talks about what you can do at the grassroots level. If you're a community organizer at the municipal level, at the state level, at the federal level, whatever level you operate at. In a really basic way, you can, get some of these materials. Ethan Gutman has a new book, The Xinjiang Procedure, Kill to Order. You can get those books into libraries. I tend to agree that raising awareness is a huge part of this, because the biggest thing we've had to break through over the last 20 years is just simply people accepting that this is real, because it sounds like science fiction, even when I talk about it today, right? But unfortunately, it's horribly real, and, hundreds of thousands of people have been killed for organs in the process. So I would say one last thing, there's Rotary Club has a whole dedicated end forced organ harvesting club now that they stood up in the last few years. So if you want to join, participate at local level, you're not ready to jump out there on your own. There's Rotary to be joined and worked on. David, please.
Yeah, I was going to say, the way you get government action in a democracy is to get the elected representatives to know about it, care about it, take initiatives about it. Whether it's a school board or a city government or a state government or a federal government, you've got a representative. And the more people that are concerned about any issue, the more likely the representative who's running for office in office is going to react to it. And reality is, if you look at these diaspora communities, they're not so small, and they're not so geographically focused. I mean, they're everywhere. And if there's just more, global realization and information is important, but I think also important is mobilization, action, initiatives. Don't just learn about it, do something about it, and particularly directed towards the people who can affect change. And if there's enough of those people doing that, then change will happen.
Thank you.
I'd like to first thank everybody for the information. All the talks were wonderful today, very informative. My name is Dr. Tatiana Denning. I'm a family medicine physician from Richmond, Virginia. I was going to ask something similar as part of my question, just if an everyday person off the street, if they found out about this information, kind of what you would advise them to do. And I think Mr. Medes' point is very valid. To encourage people to contact their representatives, I think, is one of the key things they can do. But additionally, in the medical community, any advice on helping raise awareness in the medical community and affecting change there? I know pretty much from the beginning of my career, I've seen the moral fabric of medicine fraying, and at the beginning it nearly made me want to not be a part of it. But any advice on what can be done to help in that realm?
So, Dr. Centurion.
Yes, this is an essential part of raising awareness to physicians, and I can't agree with you more. I would encourage every single person here, when you go visit your doctor, first of all, just tell them that you read a book, you saw a documentary, you heard about this, you're appalled by it, and do they know about it? And ask them to also, they can sign petitions, they can go to our website to learn more. You can, again, tell them about Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting. Tell them there's a doctors organization specifically that's been founded to try to raise awareness about these crimes and end them. And encourage them to speak to their representatives. The lawmakers, they want to hear from the medical community. That also is very powerful. Many times when we visit Congress here, they ask, well, what has this medical society said, or this medical society, that society said? They like to hear that the medical community is in support of these crimes, and that they are, believe that they're taking place, and that they're greatly concerned about them. Other countries, for example, in England and Canada, the bills that were passed in those countries were done conjointly with the medical associations of those countries. The lawmakers and the medical societies both were involved in the process, and the medical society supported that. Here in the United States, there's only been a few medical societies that have made statements, but our major AMA and all the major medical associations have not made a firm statement against forced organ harvesting. So it's crucial that we continue to reach out to the medical community. So yes, we're trying to do that, and I commend you for doing the same.
And just one more comment. I was invited by the Independent Medical Alliance to give a talk, and they gave me a framework for doing it. So I actually gave the talk for CME credits. As you know, doctors need to get these, and the ethics talks are, as I noticed, incredibly well attended. So this is something, I'm sure that the Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting has folks that could do this. I can do this now, apparently, because I did it, and people were thrilled to get their CME credits as part of a talk that on transplantation ethics, but featuring this issue as sort of a gross violations, and where things can go if things really go awry. So that's another route, perhaps.
Yeah, I could add something here too. I would suggest that every transplant patient should be told by the doctor who's dealing with them, somebody on a transplant list waiting for a transplant should be told, if you go abroad for a transplant to China, someone may be killed for their organs for that transplant. The doctors can tell that whether there's a law in place or not. I appreciate that, as we've heard, that people with morals will think twice about going to China once they've heard that, and it will convey information which I suspect many transplant patients are not aware of because they don't necessarily follow this issue. And any transplantation, any medical society anywhere can have ethics that state that doctors should tell their patients that.
Thank you. I had one final comment to make as well. I've thought before that it would be good to get this information to medical schools as well, because that's the future generation that you will be part of these different organizations. I think that's a good path as well.
I think that's right on. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And final question over here.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the time you guys took for this insightful presentation. So I am Jared Jeter. I am a political analyst at New Lines Institute, and I had a question about the scope and severity of this program on the timeline. Authoritarian regimes like China or the Soviet Union typically had these type of programs that would kind of ebb and flow, much like the Soviet, like a gulag system kind of tapered off after Khrushchev. Has anybody been aware of any evidence or kind of any data on whether or not the illegal organ harvesting program has either decreased or increased over time, and that has this problem started to taper off, or has it remained consistent or even increased as a function of this administration in China?
So, I was thinking David might like to field this one.
Yeah, well, I would say that the problem has continued and increased because obviously China doesn't report statistics about the number of prisoners of conscience killed for their organs, but what we can see is the physical effect. I mean, the buildings, the beds, and there's huge physical transplant industry in China, huge transplant hospitals, huge numbers of transplant beds, and increasing. What we also see is a shift in sourcing. The predominant numbers were when they went to prisoners of conscience were predominantly almost exclusively Falun Gong, because Falun Gong were everywhere. The numbers were huge. They were demonized by the government. They were arbitrarily indefinitely detained. They were healthy because of their exercises, and so they became the source of choice. But there's still people practicing Falun Gong in China, but they're a lot more secretively and in a lot lesser numbers than before the repression. And so they haven't become a replacement source for the numbers being killed off for their organs. But what we've seen is replacement from Uyghurs who've been detained in large numbers especially since 2017. And what we have in addition is, well, transplant hospitals and transplant wings of hospitals being built in Xinjiang, which never existed before. And we can see, I mean, the government even announces that. There's airport lanes in the Xinjiang area where the Uyghurs are that actually say reserved for the transport of organs, and we've got pictures of them. The Chinese system is. Well, I was talking about cover-up before, and it's a very clumsy cover-up because on the one hand, they like to boast what they're doing, and the other hand, they like to deny what they're doing. So that when they started shipping organs from Xinjiang around the country, because the technology developed to the point where they could do that with refrigeration techniques and neck mount machines, they actually wrote newspaper articles about that. And then we paid attention to those articles and they stopped. But So I would say that the source of organs is shifting to a certain extent, but the problem remains. And if anything, the abuse is bigger now than it was before because the transplant industry has grown since we started.
Could I maybe just also add when the persecution began and all the, transplant tourism information started coming out, there were websites in China, and there's ample documentation of this, of organs being supplied, within days, 1 to 2 weeks. Much of those were taken down, but I have screenshots of some of the transplant sites promoting organs to foreigners from just a couple of years ago, and you can see in the small print below that you still guarantee organs 2 to 3 weeks. Statistically, to be able to provide organs in that short of time, you have to have a large number of a big donor bank available. So we know that there's still plenty of organs, and the transplant industry is booming there.
The scope of it has actually been increasing.
Yes.
And just as another way of measuring, right, the number of hospitals doing the transplants has increased. And so, just to give you a sense of the numbers, David Matus and Ethan Gottman and David Kilgore, they came up with a number of 60 to 100,000 transplants annually back in 2016. And that was counting, that's actually a conservative boundary, right? In my opinion, it's sort of assuming that each hospital is doing kind of the very minimum that a single transplant team could conceivably do and be stood up, because it's expensive to have you need a whole team to do this, right? The numbers could actually be much larger, but the number of and the way that we get these kinds of numbers, every time we would report on it, expose it, those methods of getting that often would be taken away, right? So they make it harder. But one thing that has happened is the number of hospitals has grown. The other thing is, because Xinjiang is a geographically isolated population, right, and it's also ethnically look different and so forth, what they've done up there is they've actually blood typed and tissue typed a large portion of the population in their homes to do this kind of matching, which typically you would need to have someone fully incarcerated to do. So all these types of things and the growth of these hospitals show us that this is just kind of growing, and there's a huge market for it. Remember, in any ethical system, the supply of organs is always a lot less than the demand, and they take advantage of that. They basically weaponize that because, if you're desperate, well, there's somewhere you can go.
And there's allegations of complicity by Western companies. I think the allegations are made regarding Thermo Fisher Scientific and the DNA markers. So that's how they're able to find organ matches among this population. And yes, now with the large number of Uyghurs under detention and the blood that's drawn, that is what some of the allegations are.
Well, if I could get everyone to give our esteemed panelists a big round of applause. Thank you for taking on this incredibly difficult issue. And thank you everyone for being such a great audience with this very difficult issue.
All right, what a wonderful panel to address such a very critical issue. So a little special section right now, just 5 minutes, but I want to emphasize one organization has made tremendous contribution to the investigation about the forced organ harvesting crime. And as you see, this is a world organization to investigate the persecution of Falun Gong. From the name you can tell, originally its whole focus was to investigate CCP's persecution of Falun Gong. While they're doing all kinds of investigation, they find out China was conducting serious crime of forced organ harvesting on live Falun Gong practitioners. So in the last 20 years, these organizations has put tremendous efforts to make phone call into China, to dig out the information, talk to Chinese officials, and find out credible evidence for forced organ harvesting on live Falun Gong practitioners. So I'm very honored to invite the president of the organization, Mr. Dr. Wang Ziyuan, to give 5 minutes quick remark. And please.
尊敬的各位议员，尊敬的各位来宾，我代表追查迫害法轮功国际组织，在这里宣告一个正经人类良知的结果。中共大量活摘法轮功学员器官，不是传说，也不是猜测，而是有大量的第一手证据证明，并且有中共高层亲口承认的国家群体灭绝犯罪、反人类罪。
Honorable guests, on behalf of the World Organization to investigate the persecution of Falun Gong, I stand here to declare a conclusion that shakes the conscience of humanity. The CCP's organ harvesting from living Falun Gong practitioners is not a rumor, not speculation, but a state-sanctioned crime of genocide and a crime against humanity, supported by substantial first-hand evidence and, crucially, personally acknowledged by the highest levels of the CCP.
20多年来，我们的调查员一通又一通的秘密电话拨到中国的医院、政法委、监狱系统以及中共的最高层。20年来，我们发表了413篇调查报告，取得了866个电话调查录音的证据，积累了4000多个资料证据，其中66份录音证据是加害者本人亲口承认、直接指证的犯罪的铁证。这份名单触目惊心啊！5名中共中央政治局常委张高丽、李长春、张德江、周永康、曾庆红，还有军委副主席郭伯雄、政治救援商务部长薄熙来、国防部长梁光烈、解放军总后勤部卫生部的部长白世忠，还有41家器官移植医院的45名院长、主任、主刀医生，他们在电话中亲口涉及的活摘法轮功学员器官。
For over 20 years, our investigators have made countless secret phone calls to hospitals, the political and legal affairs commissions, the prison system, and the CCP's highest levels. In these 20 years, we have published 413 investigative reports, obtained 866 pieces of first-hand audio recording evidence, and over 4,000 pieces of documentary evidence. Among these, 66 recordings are irrefutable evidence provided by the perpetrators themselves, directly confessing to and corroborating the crimes. The list is shocking. 5 members of the Politburo Standing Committee of the Communist Party of China, Zhang Gaoli, Li Changchun, Zhang Dejiang, Zhou Yongkang, and Zeng Qinghong, Guo Boxiong, Vice Chairman of the Central Military Commission, Bo Xilai, member of the Politburo and Minister of Commerce, Liang Guanglie, Minister of National Defense, and Bai Shuzhong, Minister of Health of the General Logistics Department of the People's Liberation Army. Furthermore, 45 hospital directors, chief surgeons, and surgeons from 41 organ transplant hospitals personally discussed organ harvesting from Falun Gong practitioners over the phone.
这些电话录音，我们都在追查国际的网站上有原声录音，在那里发布了，大家可以去听，可以见证。朋友们，我要特别告诉大家，2015年6月24日，我以江泽民办公室刘秘书的身份，直接拨通了时任中共中央政治局常委、国务院副总理的张高丽。当我提到要他在政治局常委会上主旨追究江泽民同志下令活摘几百万法轮功学员器官的责任时，这位中共中央政治局常委、国务院副总理没有表示惊讶，也没表示不理解，更没有反对，而只回答了一句：“哦，一定的。”当我第3次再确认他追究江主席下令活摘几百万法轮功学员器官这个事情很重，责任很大，你明白吗？你懂吗？他说什么？哦，还请江主席放宽心吧。
All the audio recordings are available on our website, accessible to anyone who wishes to consult them. But let me give you one particular example. On June 24th, 2015, I, posing as Secretary Liu from Jiang Zemin's office, directly called Zhang Gaoli, then a member of the Politburo Standing Committee and Vice Premier of the State Council, at the time poised to investigate Jiang's role in the persecution of Falun Gong. Over the phone, and as Jiang's secretary, I asked Zhang Gaoli to stop investigating the culpability of Comrade Jiang Zemin for ordering the harvesting of organs from millions of Falun Gong practitioners at the Politburo Standing Committee meeting. This member, Zhang Gaoli of the Politburo Standing Committee and Vice Premier of the State Council, showed no surprise, no unawareness, and no opposition. He simply replied, "Oh, definitely." I pressed him another time, saying earnestly at last, "You should know that investigating the forced harvesting of organs from millions of Falun Gong practitioners has serious consequences. You understand?" To which he replied, "Please assure Chairman Jiang not to worry at all."
2020年1月份，我们电话取证中共空军军医大学西京医院的移植科医生李国伟，这就是原来的第4军医大学，位于西安。他毫不犹豫地承诺可以提供法轮功学员器官，甚至说只要你们胆大敢看，我可以把你领到床头上，让你亲眼看到这就是20几岁的人。朋友们，这不是经书的小说的情节，这是一位器官医生的医生在电话里若无其事的在谈论着活在一个活生生人的器官，在谋取暴利，讲虐杀，将活人是商品化，将虐杀当作日常工作在谈论。这正是这一场血腥屠杀的真实残忍的写照。
In January 2020, we telephoned Dr. Li Guowei, a nephrologist at Xijing Hospital of the Air Force Medical University, for evidence. He readily promised to provide organs from Falun Gong practitioners, even saying, "If you're bold enough, if you dare to look, I can take you to the bedside so you can see for yourself that this person is only in his 20s. Friends, this isn't a scene from a horror novel. This is an organ transplant surgeon casually discussing harvesting organs from another living person for exorbitant profits over the phone. This cold-blooded commodification of living people and the routine of torture and murder are the most cruel portrayal of this bloody and lucrative industry.
我再补充一句，我给他打过4次电话，最后一次电话，我以追查国际调查员的身份告诉他，给你一个机会，立功赎罪。他怎么说呢？你不要跟我说，你去问共产党，中国就是一党制。大家听听看，这共产党的官员所谓的人民的公仆。除了电话录音之外，我们还掌握了大量的证人证词。沈阳军区医院有目击者的举证了活摘的全过程。美籍华人陆书恒举证他家人参与上海武警医院活摘法轮功学员器官时不打麻药的惨烈景象。日本经济评论家管元昌先生亲眼目睹北京武警总院把20几岁的一个法轮功学员砍断了他的四肢的肌腱，绑在床上，准备活摘他的肝脏。为什么呢？防止他反抗。解放军307医院住在丰台的307医院，一个器官联系人陈强，他甚至于说什么他们是官方警方监狱一条龙在运作法轮功学员器官。当我问到他 我说你如何证明他是法轮功学员？他说我怎么证明是法轮功？到时我们上面会给你他身份的材料。黑龙江牡丹江市的610办公室的一个科长叫朱家平，他在电话里甚至于说，他们高调的说啊，他们活摘了当地法轮功学员的器官，高一系的器官，而且器官已经卖掉了。哎。
Besides the phone recordings, we have also obtained a large number of witness testimonies. At the Shenyang Military Region General Hospital, eyewitnesses testified to the entire process of forced organ harvesting. Lu Shuheng, a Chinese American, testified that his family witnessed the horrific scene of forced organ harvesting from living Falun Gong practitioners at the Shanghai Armed Police Hospital without anesthesia. Japanese economic commentator Sugawara Usio witnessed the Beijing Armed Police General Hospital severing the tendons of a Falun Gong practitioner in his 20s, tying him to a bed and preparing to harvest his liver. Chen Qiang, a transplant liaison at the PLA 307 hospital, even admitted that they operated a streamlined process involving officials, police, and prisons, and could provide identification materials of Falun Gong practitioners as donors. Zhu Jiabin, section chief of the 610 office in Mudanjiang City, Heilongjiang province, openly admitted to harvesting organs from living Falun Gong practitioner Gao Yixi and selling them.
我从事调查活摘器官20多年，前10年我经常在睡梦中惊醒，仿佛眼前就看见那个血淋淋的场面。现在人们很多都不相信，现在已经社会化了，人们才开始震惊。有多少家医院参与？有证据的891家医院，9856个执业医生涉嫌参与其中。这是一条从中共中央政治局常委到地方610办公室到手术台的完整的犯罪链条。它的目的只有一个，就彻底的灭绝真善人的信仰，同时用器官移植谋取的暴利反过来喂养维系这个犯罪政权。各位朋友们，历史上从来没有过一个政权如此系统的、长久的、这样赤裸裸的把活人当作出售的商品、出售的器官库。
891 hospitals and 9,519 licensed doctors are suspected of involvement. This is a complete criminal chain, from members of the Politburo Standing Committee to local 610 offices and down to the operating table. Its sole purpose is to completely eradicate the belief in truthfulness, compassion, forbearance, while simultaneously using the exorbitant profits from organ transplantation to feed and sustain this criminal regime. This crime has continued for 27 years and is still ongoing. Ladies and gentlemen, never before in history has a regime so systematically, so persistently, and so blatantly treated living people as an organ bank for sale.
暴政可以杀人，却无法消灭真相；权力可以掩盖一时，却掩盖不了20多年如山的铁证。每一份录音都是无法抹去的口供，每一个证人都是暴政灭绝罪的见证，每一个名字都已经记在历史的。正义或许迟到，但绝不会缺席。中共是一个恐怖组织，是祸害人类的魔鬼。今天在座的每一位都是揭穿这个魔鬼的见证者。谢谢各位。
Tyranny can kill, but it cannot destroy the truth. Power can cover up for a time, but it cannot conceal the overwhelming evidence accumulated over 2 decades. Every recording is an indelible confession. Every witness is a testament to tyranny. and every name is already recorded in history. Justice may be delayed, but it will never be absent. The CCP is a state-sponsored terrorist organization, a devil that plagues humanity, and everyone present today is a witness to the exposing of this devil. Thank you.